For a good part of the 1970s, many big science fiction movies tended to be more grounded on planet Earth. But that changed in 1977 when George Lucas obliterated box office records with Star Wars. Following that lucrative saga in a galaxy far, far away, suddenly everyone in Hollywood was desperate for their own profitable outer space epic and merchandising juggernaut. Over the next few years, audiences would travel the spaceways with Battlestar Galactica, a big-screen resuscitation of Star Trek, pulp comic heroes Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, the terrified blue-collar crew of Alien, and even James Bond trading his Walther for energy weapons in Moonraker. Disney's own journey into the cosmos was The Black Hole, an eerie, slow burner that, unlike the studio's previous releases, was targeting more mature moviegoers, but was also sure to squeeze in some thrilling laser gun battles, action figure-ready robots, and spectacular special effects. But the studio's expensive Singularity failed to pull significant crowds to its event horizon when it drifted into theaters in 1979.
You mean we're going into the black hole?
Yes, launch the probe and find out what the fuck happened to this movie. The story of The Black Hole actually first began swirling several years before Star Wars blasted onto screens. The project started out in 1974 as a script called Space Station 1, originally conceived as an Irwin Allen-style disaster movie. But that version floated through development hell for years, until Star Wars prompted the studio to seriously reconsider its sci-fi slate. Propelled by the runaway success of Luke Skywalker's adventure, the project was dusted off and started to gain momentum. Disney immediately understood their movie would need something special for it to visually stand apart from everyone else in the race to space. Legendary film artist Peter Ellenshaw, who was responsible for visual magic in Disney classics Mary Poppins and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, was lured out of retirement to work on production design. He was joined by his talented son Harrison, who had done amazing matte paintings for, appropriately enough, Star Wars. The Ellenshaws scrapped most of the existing NASA-inspired designs by artist Robert McCall, who coincidentally would go on to Star Trek the Motion Picture, which would end up being a direct box office competitor to The Black Hole. As the look of the film was being determined, the studio searched for someone to sit behind the camera. British director John Hough, who had made the Orson Welles' Treasure Island and Disney's Escape to Witch Mountain, was originally attached to direct the project, but the pre-production process dragged on too long, and Hough departed due to other commitments. The studio then approached Gary Nelson, who was primarily a TV director but had recently made Disney's body swap comedy Freaky Friday. Nelson read the script and immediately said, "Nope." Nelson liked the general idea, but thought the script was filled with an excess of melodrama and families in peril and what he described as typical Disney bullshit. But the studio was persistent and convinced the director to meet with Peter Ellenshaw to see some of the concept artwork and miniature models that had been made. That enticing imagery and the opportunity to work with advanced filmmaking technology sealed the deal for Nelson. Disney had realized they would really need to dazzle audiences in the wake of George Lucas's groundbreaking blockbuster, and to compete with other upcoming studio sci-fi projects in the pipeline. Over $1 million of the budget went to developing sophisticated new computer-controlled technology called ACES, the Automatic Camera Effects System, and a complex matte scan ability that allowed a camera to pan and tilt across matte paintings, rather than the static shots that the process previously required. The movie would ultimately include several hundred effects shots, including a then unprecedented 150 matte paintings, filmed with the revolutionary process. For the movie's spacecraft, Ellenshaw and his artists took a different approach from the kit-bashing method of Star Wars, where vehicles were assembled out of random bits found in various plastic-scale models. Instead, the Black Hole's vessels were built from thousands of tiny machined pieces of brass and took several months to construct. The detailed models of the massive USS Cygnus were each 12 feet in length and weighed almost 200 pounds. Numerous models were also built of Vincent and the other key robots, because separate versions were each required for specific actions and movements the machines would perform. But the script, which had already cycled through a half-dozen writers, would quickly get jettisoned out the airlock as Gary Nelson made considerable alterations. The key element of an ominous black hole had endured through every draft, but an expansive cast was reduced to just a handful of major characters, and the plot was transformed from a standard rescue adventure to more of an atmospheric mystery with a haunted house vibe, which better suited the gothic tone of Ellenshaw's artwork. With the story stabilized, it was time to find some actors to send into space. The part of the Palomino's Captain Holland went to Robert Forster, perhaps best known at the time for the drama Medium Cool. His impulsive right-hand man, Charlie Pizer, would be played by Joseph Bottoms, who had made an impression on the TV miniseries Holocaust. Also joining the crew would be Psycho star Anthony Perkins and screen veteran Ernest Borgnine. The familiar voices of Roddy McDowall and Slim Pickens would give uncredited post-production life to the hovering robots Vincent and Bob. For the role of Dr. Kate McCrae, the scientist who can telepathically communicate with Vincent, Nelson had considered Sigourney Weaver in her pre-Ripley days, but that idea was shot down by the casting director, allegedly because they just didn't like her name. Whoops. Instead, they cast model-turned-actor Jennifer O'Neill, who had made her screen breakthrough in the 1971 period drama Summer of 42. But when Gary Nelson began shooting zero-gravity footage, he discovered that the limp performance of her long, flowing hair was shattering the illusion of floating weightless in space. After some back and forth, O'Neill finally agreed to substantially trim her hair for the movie. Unfortunately, the same night of the fateful haircut, she was hospitalized after a serious car accident. With shooting underway, the part was quickly recast with Yvette Mimieux, whose own long blonde hair would also get snipped for the same zero-gravity compliance. For Hans Reinhardt, the enigmatic, obsessed captain of the long-lost starship Cygnus, Nelson had set his sights on respected Austrian actor Maximilian Schell. Despite word of the performer's mercurial temperament, Nelson traveled to Vienna to meet with the actor about the project, only for Schell to instead recommend Jason Robards, who he praised for his work in the recent political miniseries Washington Behind Closed Doors. But when Nelson informed the actor that it was he himself who had directed that TV drama, he said that Schell, quote, gave me a great big kiss on the mouth and said, I will do your movie, and that was it. Ironically, the movie's menacing red robot Maximilian, supposedly inspired by Fantasia's demon Chernobog, had already been given its name before Schell was cast. The project had been retitled Space Probe 1, but both Nelson and Disney's marketing department were, unsurprisingly, not happy with the name. Supposedly, before shooting started, new name suggestions were solicited from nearly all of Disney's employees, and more than 500 different possibilities were considered before they inevitably settled on the Black Hole, which kinda seems like the obvious one. Principal photography began in October of 1978, with the ambitious project taking up all 4 of Disney's available sound stages. The film was mostly shot chronologically, with some particular challenges from wire work stunts, especially in the tight Palomino interior scenes that open the movie. Forster, Bottoms, and Mimieux received a crash course circus camp training to learn how to perform on wires. And while nowadays those wires would simply be digitally removed in post-production, hiding them for the black hole required some creativity, like painting the wires the same color as the background, or flipping footage upside down in post-production, since most viewers wouldn't think to look for wires running to the floor. In total, the movie's zero-G stunts took up over 40 shooting days, and while the actors initially enjoyed the suspension experience, the process would eventually take a physical toll, with Forster later describing the harness as a literal ball breaker. With the movie's astronomical scope and technical complexity, the shooting process was slow going. Depending on the scene and how much was involved, some days might result in only one shot being filmed. The cast and crew would prep for the scene in the morning, rehearse, and then capture the footage in the afternoon. Principal photography ended up running for 26 weeks. For that memorable moment where Anthony Perkins' scientist perishes by off-camera evisceration at the whirling blades of homicidal robot Maximilian, the failed paper protection was actually an improvisation on the day. According to Nelson, quote, I just had this visual of Tony holding up this book with all his great knowledge to protect himself, and Maximilian just grinds him up. Another unscripted moment was Reinhardt's subsequent plea to Kate, which Schell came up with himself.
Protect me from Maximilian.
But late in production, there was one minor problem. The script still had no ending, aside from a vague statement about the surviving heroes entering the black hole. Nelson had pushed through shooting with the assumption that he or the Ellenshaws would eventually concoct a fantastic finale, but after 125 days of filming, it was still a concerning void. Nelson came up with an idea to push into a close-up of Kate's eye and pull out to a shot of Michelangelo's famous Creation of Adam painting, but the studio got cold feet about the religious connotations and rejected it. Instead, Nelson and Ellenshaw ultimately set the process of capturing and completing the movie's special effects proved worthwhile, as the filmmakers and studio were impressed by the results, particularly the iconic main corridor meteor sequence, a skillful composite of miniatures, mats, and live-action elements. Director Gary Nelson later described Peter Ellenshaw as a genius and called the team of in-house Disney effects artists magnificent. Their extraordinary work earned an Oscar nomination for visual effects, but would lose the statue to Ridley Scott's Alien. The black hole's stunning special effects would be front and center for the movie's hype machine, and Disney was fully prepared for a potential merchandise sales bonanza, with 1 million copies of the novelization, 6 million action figures and playsets, and a broad range of other tie-in toys, games, and goodies already on store shelves for the 1979 holiday season before the movie even hit screens. The Black Hole arrived in theaters on December 21st, 1979, just in time for Christmas. Released under the Buena Vista banner, it was the first PG-rated Disney movie, aiming for a more adult audience after 4 decades of strictly G-rated releases from the Mouse House. The budget, which was first estimated at $18 million, had expanded to $20 million. At that point, the most expensive movie ever made by Disney. Reaching screens just 2 weeks after Star Trek: The Motion Picture, The Black Hole seemed to suffer in the wake of the Enterprise's return, and was hardly a box office phenomenon, collecting $4.5 million on its first weekend and finishing with $35 million domestic, just a fraction of the $230 million total of Star Wars in its initial 1977 box office run. Even the R-rated Alien had made $60 million over the summer of 1979. Critics at the time were predominantly negative, calling the movie ambitious but hokey and dull. Many younger Star Wars fans who had anticipated more exhilarating outer space adventure were bored by the pacing or horrified by the lobotomized crew. And let's be honest, Maximilian was cool, but Vincent and Bob were no C-3PO and R2-D2. The Black Hole toys that were expected to occupy homes alongside X-Wings and Darth Vaders quickly ended up in store discount bins instead. Of course, Disney would eventually get its own Star Wars in the form of, well, Star Wars. But over the years, The Black Hole has developed a solid cult following from viewers who appreciate the unsettling tone and deliberate tempo, the qualified cast, the moody John Barry score, and even that audaciously bizarre metaphysical ending. Though it was a commercial failure at the time, the risky proposition has remained a noteworthy part of the Disney portfolio, and the studio was once even developing a remake with Tron Legacy and Top Gun Maverick director Joseph Kosinski. That update seems to have been sucked into a cosmic anomaly, but for many sci-fi fans, the technical ingenuity and breathtaking imagery of the 1979 original still hold up after more than 40 years.